Hello, everybody, and thank you and welcome to our monthly on project management. Today, we're going to talk about a special topic in project management, which is really project portfolio management. As many of you are aware, for the portfolio management practitioners out there, this is a relatively young field, a new field within the broader umbrella of project management. And what purpose of today's presentation is really based on research that PMO Advisory and myself, Dr. T, been spearheading, trying to have a better understanding of the world of project management. So for those of you who knows portfolio management, it is still relatively young, and there are a lot of processes and common practices that may not be fully substantiated. And what research tried to do is uncover what are some of these underlying factors. So I hope this is going to be interesting to everybody who joined this webinar. And for those of you who really enjoy our webinar, please take the opportunity to subscribe to our channel on YouTube. So let me start a little bit about myself. My name is Dr. T. Bu, and I wear multiple hats. I'm the CEO of PMO Advisory. I am also a university professor at Montclair State University, China Europe International Business School. I'm fairly certified with PMP, PGMP, Portfolio Management, PFMP, and Risk, and you can see a little bit about my background. What I'd like to bring to the table is really try to bridge the gap between the world of practice, so how people actually apply project management, portfolio management, out of the academic side, more sort of the ivory tower research, and try to find the best blend of both worlds. So from a research perspective, to make sure they're applicable to use, and from the practice perspective, to make sure they're indeed following good and best practices. So that's a little bit about myself. So today we're going to cover a fairly quick agenda of the current state of project portfolio from my view. The purpose of the study that we have, a brief overview of the surveys and the 10 findings, and then ultimately talk about what are some of the summaries and then how to claim the PDUs. So throughout the presentation, I encourage you to ask questions using chat. And if you want, you could even unmute yourself. And if it gets noisy, I guess I'll mute everybody. But if it's not noisy, unmute yourself, ask the question, and then unmute yourself. Remute, just to make sure the line stays clear. Okay, so let's look at the state of portfolio management. The project portfolio management is a relatively new field. By the way, portfolio management itself in business is actually been around for those of you who finances, you know, portfolio has been around easily since the 50s, not the 60s. And even in corporate strategy side, the idea of organizing ideas, endeavors, activities into portfolios has been in the literature since the 60s. But from a project management perspective, the idea of organizations having limited resources and have a lot of things they want to do, and how to pick and choose the few that maximize the organization value, that side is relatively young. So Exelo perspective, for example, they published the first publication, I think major publication that was widely adopted, was a management portfolio in 2011. And I should mention that PMI actually published a standard, of the standard for portfolio management before that. I think it's around 2005 perspective, but it wasn't really widely adopted until about the third edition. In 2013, PMI formally introduced a new certification called Project Portfolio Professional, PFMP. Today, there are about 800 some certified. And one of my claim to fame is, if I count that correctly, I was in the starter group. And I believe I was the 8th person in the world certified in PFMP. Actually took the test in December, I think, of 2013. And at the time, they didn't give you the score right away, didn't tell you whether you passed or not. They asked more than 5 months in May of 2014, that's when they released the people who passed, and I was one. As both a practitioner and researcher, I have multiple observations. So for those of you who know a little bit about my career, as head of global services for one of the larger organizations managing project program portfolio management. So I have significant experience in both the academic side, the teaching side, as well as the practice side. And I basically have three major observations when it comes to the current state of portfolio management. The first is best practices, or even common practices are rare in project portfolio management, partly because this is new, but more so than just new. I think about portfolio management quite differently, which gets to a point. Most people, practitioners or academics, researchers, they have a partial or limited understanding. So instead of optimizing the portfolio management, they look at selected problems and maybe they able to, for example, resource allocation is a very big theme in portfolio management. So they may come up with the best algorithm or process for resource allocation, but they have the oversight and not seeing the intersection with strategic alignment, for example, the governance, the risk management, and other areas. So overall, it's tend to be the last big problem that leads to why there are relatively few best practice or common practice in portfolio management is the significant gap that exists between the academic theories and studies with the real world of application. And to be fair, this gap exists in every single field, especially social science fields. In project management, you face the same set of challenges. But in this case, portfolio management, because it's relatively young, the gap is even bigger. For example, if you were to scan literatures on project portfolio management, they tend to assume a fairly simplified homogeneous environment, meaning it's almost always at the enterprise portfolio level, sometimes IT portfolio level. They always assume the manager is accountable, fully accountable for the process and the result. Later, as you'll see in the study, that's not the case. On the flip side, if you look at the world of practitioner, you face a different set of challenges. The practitioners tend to look at their world and only their world, which of course you can do them if you work for a company, but they tend to overemphasize on the uniqueness of their situation and hence leading to a lot of overcomplication. So what I hope to do as a part of my goal, professional goal in life, is to try to bridge these. Yes, the world is probably more complicated than what most researchers think, but hopefully you could find common threads, themes, practices that can be shared across and to simplify the actual world of practice. So in a nutshell, that's what a lot of research and what I like to do. So what is a landscape study? Portfolio management, we call it landscape study because it looks over the sort of the broad picture of the topology environment in which this is being practiced. So in academic study, the landscape study tend to focus on these broad profiles of activity that shapes the field and the topology of relevant and important features and attributes. So this study tried to address some of the common questions, and some of them can be quite insightful. And by the way, the reason that you may be interested, aside from just understanding this, is also that you, as a portfolio manager, use this information to generate new ideas how you want to shape your portfolio, as well as benchmarking against some of the data here that may be helpful to you. So we try to address, and these are just a couple, there are a couple more, of course, how much time do portfolio managers spend on portfolio management? Do they have other duties, for example? The accountability of portfolio professionals. Are they accountable or are they more in a supportive role? What is the relative importance of the selective set of business objectives that you hear a lot? And by the way, here, the gap between the academic side and practice side is actually pretty big. What percentage of programs in your immediate organization business unit that are not managed in portfolio management, even though the company spend the effort and resources of building portfolio management. So it's really interesting. You have the discipline, but do you actually use it? And what is relative maturity based on what we have seen? So this study addresses these and a couple of additional questions. By the way, feel free to jump in with questions. As I mentioned, I have a chat box open on the machine so I could see a lot of the interactions. Today, we started this survey actually slightly before the pandemic, right in February. And as you can imagine, starting any study in February of this year is probably not a good idea because people become extraordinarily distracted, and for the right reason, because of the pandemic. So we went to a low for really the March, April, May timeframe. And in some ways, this webinar, even though we are reviewing the preliminary data, we're hoping that a lot of you who's on this call will be happy to contribute their thoughts to the survey as well. So at the end, there is a link for you can also participate. But today we have 54 good responses. We actually got over 70 some responses, but some of them were not complete, or at least not complete enough. Others were just hard to make out the data. So we eliminated those and only treated the ones that had quality content. The next two slides, this slide, the next one just shows you a broad profile of people who completed. So in this case, we have almost 60% on managers and team leads, another 33% director, vice president. We do have some senior executives as well as C-level, about 43% each. You also see in terms of the chart, the organization by expenditure, by the size of the organization. And what's interesting is we have some very large organization responding, or people from large organization responding. So it's a little bit more representative. You could see also the organization by size of people. What's interesting is about right in the middle, to be by coincidence, the majority of the organization responding, the size is between 100 to 500 people. Again, some organizations are very large, or smaller organization. By the way, the smaller organization tend to be more consulting organizations. So they're looking at the portfolio really with external customers in mind, doing engagements for their customers. And then organization type. The way we like to tend to break things down is into the for-profit side, the private versus public company. And then you have the nonprofit organization, government institute, and we sort of have a catch-all bucket. Countries, the organization could belong to different buckets. So you can see we have a representative cross-section of the various company types. The next just looks at the country of respondents, the term of number of people responding. So for example, China have 2 people, United States, 33 people responded, etc. And then you can also look across the industries. Again, fairly representative of the industries, partly because of our background. We tend to have people in the engineering side quite a lot. So that's a little bit about the profile. So let's look at the findings. And my intention is to highlight the 10, what I consider the most important findings of the study. So first of all, in terms of looking at the portfolio management, it resides at very different in the organization. So as shown here, the blue, for example, 38%, 37.7, respondents works in multi-business unit enterprises. These tend to be more global, multinational companies with multiple business units, product lines. And so about 38% of the respondents fall into that camp. The portfolio resides at the enterprise level, top company level for these organizations. And about 23% work in smaller organization, also at the enterprise level, but in a single business unit environment. So this clearly shows that over 60%, or right about 60% of the portfolio resides at the enterprise level. But it also resides at other levels. About 23% of portfolio reside at departmental levels, and about 11% organized regionally. I'm sorry, actually, since we create this, we update the chart, so it should say 24.5% of portfolios resides at the department level. So we update these charts on occasion. So it gives you a flavor. So what this information is useful is most of the portfolios study exists at the enterprise level, even though it can be other places in the organization. Again, if you have questions, feel free to jump in. The second
I have a
question,
Dr. T.
Yes, please.
You know, as you're going through all this data and information, I'm struggling to understand what is still fairly new about portfolio management to corporations, since portfolio management has been around a long time. What is it really that's new to them? Is it really the practice?
So here you have to add the project in front of portfolio management. So you're right. As I think I mentioned in the introduction, from a risk perspective, especially financial perspective, portfolio management has been practiced really pretty widely since the 50s. From a corporate strategy perspective, portfolio management has also been practiced, at least in the literature, starting about the mid-60s. And I think organizations start to looking at and thinking about their organization portfolios quite early on. But from a project perspective, so if you go into the broad umbrella of project management, the organization that's adopting project management and achieving a certain set of maturity, that itself is a fairly significant endeavor. So I think it's new to the organization mainly because of a general organic maturity path that organization go through. In project management, the first area most organizations try to develop some competencies, some maturity, and process is likely to be in project management. And from there, as the organizations start tackling bigger and bigger projects, they may naturally move into program management, which is another discipline we didn't really talk about here. But as companies start having competition for internal resources and a lot of ideas, they may inevitably move toward portfolio management, and that happens to be a later stage. So I think it is really path dependent on how the organization develops. Now, the other thing I should mention is that collective industries, portfolio management may very well be around for a very long time, but it is not a consistent processes and studies, and it is hardly a global endeavor in which there are a lot of studies and standards written against that. So those are really the reason for the relative newness of portfolio management. So thank you for that question. I hope I addressed that. Okay. And others, please jump in with question because I think that's how we make it interactive. So thank you. I think it was Michael for asking that question. Okay. So the second finding is how much time portfolio managers spend on the actual portfolio management activities. You would expect that it's actually should be pretty high. The answer is no, it actually varies quite a lot. Less than 25% of portfolio managers are dedicated to portfolio management. More than 55% spend less than 50% of their time. So what that shows me, and if I were to interpret the data, is that a lot of people work in a project management office, PMO, or program management office environment, in which project PMO managers or directors, you may have multiple responsibility, and portfolio management tend to be one of many. By the way, it shows up later in the data on the maturity because people are, let's say, not spending that dedicated time. Is the maturity of portfolio management is likely to be lower as well. So this is just more for interesting part of benchmarking your time, and it really does depend on portfolio management in their organization, how much time they spend. Now, this one is quite interesting. This is a question of accountability. And by the way, we try to simplify and forgot to put in the latest slide, so took out some of these numbers, but they essentially shows the same number. And we really asked the people the question around what are they accountable? Are they fully accountable, meaning they are 100% responsible for not just the managing process management, but also managing the result, the performance. So that's fully accountable. Semi-accountable tend to be in situations in which the portfolio managers are responsible for the processes, not necessarily for the performance or fully accountable for performance. So the buck doesn't really stop with you. It does stop with somebody else. And then the third is it's really not accountable. They have a lot of responsibilities. They are managing processes, but the result, both process side and also achieving the performance and value, resides with somebody else, could be a higher level executive, for example. So in that scenario, as you can see here, our study shows quite distributed. In terms of the fully accountable, it's really less than 20% people. So less than 20% of the portfolio managers out there, based on our study, are fully accountable for portfolio management. Most of them have some level of the others accountability. Accountable for the process, but not necessarily for the results, or play a more supportive role. And this is something that's very evident in our data. And by the way, we've been watching the trend for this for some time, and this sort of the breakdown between 20%, 50%, 28%, give or take, has been actually fairly consistent. More data, this number just repeats itself.
So, Dr. T,
Yes, please.
and ask, what is it going to take to be a portfolio manager who is really responsible for the project investment of a corporation? I mean, do they have to be an executive?
That's a really good question. When PMI, so I have another presentation that I give sometimes on the project management career path. And what I believe in terms of the portfolio management is that to be a especially if you're fully accountable, you are already fairly high up in the corporate ladder. It's hard to say exactly where you are right now. For example, project managers in most organizations are really from the entry-level management to maybe slightly north of middle. Portfolio management, to be fully accountable with that budgetary resource authority, puts you at senior to the executive. Step beyond portfolio management, if you look at the full career of project manager, is beyond portfolio manager, you have the role we call the chief project officer. Now, it may not be exact chief in there. It could be executive, your project directors, etc. Essentially, you move into that role. So to answer your question, in short, for a portfolio manager to, let's say, fully accountable, chances are they are already at that very senior management role. Sorry, just going back. Senior management role. It depends on the organization. It depends on how organization views project management. Put it this way, if an organization views project management as a tactical set of activities to get things done, chances are they'll view portfolio management as a tactical set of activities to help to pick and choose projects as well as providing governance. Chances are in that organization, best it may be upper middle level management. In another organization that looks at project as a strategic capability to help companies build new capabilities. And they also view portfolio management as a strategic counterpart to project management to help the company choose the right project and make the right investment. Then in that organization, the project professional are far more likely to achieve the C level, or if not quite the C level, come, let's say, a shade below that, right? The aspiration in our field for chief project for project management is really looking at reaching all the way to the chief project officer side. That would be the topmost level. Now, incidentally, by the way, I just did another article published about chief project officer. For those of you that's interested, you could just Google it, type Journal of Business Strategy, chief project officer, and you could actually pull up that study that we did. So that's another topic for another day.
Thank you, Dr. T.
Okay. And yes, please call me T or Dr. Thank you. So the next thing we look at is what are some of the most important goals and objectives? And we pull 5 from most commonly mentioned business objective. There could be many others, of course, but the top 5 most that's in the literature and people talk about from a practitioner side tend to be, strategic realization of goals, helping the organization planning project to that of strategy and making sure the goals are delivered. Governance is another big one. Help to make tough decisions. How do we guide decision-making process? How do even portfolio lifecycle move from one stage to another? That whole area is really called governance. Risk management, another big one. How to balance risk versus reward, and looking at the uncertainty of the organization. And I'm sure you could imagine probably would have changed this profile to some extent. Resource allocation. Resource allocation is really interesting. Tactical basis. It is probably one of the most important rationale for portfolio management. And when I say tactical, I'm talking activity. Studies, research on portfolio management overwhelmingly, for some reason, tend to focus on resource allocation. And then the last is a definition that we adopted from the PMI. They have a definition for program and portfolio management, in which they talked about a little bit around the synergy, how to get the people to work together. So I see Lauren's title. Lauren, I'll come back to you with the URL. Maybe I'll find it if we finish this early, and I'll send it to everybody. So anyway, so taking these major business objective that we found to be the most frequently mentioned, we ask people 2 questions around that. One is on a scale 1 to 5, how will you rate them? 5.1 being the least important. And the big graph here you see is the ranking. So clearly, strategic realization of goals is number 1. And that is a bit of a surprise. Actually, in most literature, they actually tend to focus more on resource allocation. Governance is number 2. Again, thank you, Michael, for finding that article. Is a bit of a surprise as well, because we actually didn't think it was that high, just from a perspective, looking at different literature and talking to practitioners. But number 1, number 2 are actually a bit of a surprise. The other 3 are all good. I mean, they are solid in the 3 range, and with resource allocation being the most. So not much surprise there. The chart on the right, you can see 57, 37, 15, 19, 17. That chart represents how many of them pick that area as their number 1 priority. So instead of asking on a scale 1 to 5, on the other side of the question, just basically ask, if you have to pick one, which one is your topmost? And clearly here you could see that the realization goals is also number. So I think from this study, we could say emphatically that most organization, most practitioner adopts portfolio management because they want to make sure their strategy is executed well, period. Resource allocation is really important. And it does show up in some of our other questions, but really more of a tactical solution to the problem of how do we best use the resource that we have. Okay, so so that's good. Okay, moving on. This is an interesting question we asked. Organization with portfolio management may not fully utilize it. And this came as a bit of surprise. As you could imagine, one of the reasons for portfolio management being a relatively new field is that it takes a lot of in my consulting world that I came from, and I still do sometimes, I help come with portfolio management. Right? And one of the most difficult things about building a portfolio management is to have those set of agree, for example, the criteria to evaluate the project. And you can see this is a common problem in business. If you are, let's say, in charge of sales and sitting in a room with another person in charge of manufacturing, well, clearly both of you probably have different priorities. And if you're throwing another, let's say, a human resource professional there, they'll have a third set of priorities. So for a company who already spend this headache and heartache and blood and sweat, well, maybe not the blood part, but definitely the sweat part, to build the portfolio management thing, they want to use it. Well, the study have shown actually not so much. Only 37% of companies that or respondents respond that they fully utilize portfolio management. This is after building it. This is not before building it. Right? So, and also means that, of course, the vast majority of the company use it only partially. So we thought this is an interesting find, because even company who has it, for some reason, did not fully adopt it. Now, there could be good reasons. This is not to say reasons. One reason, for example, is portfolio management wasn't adopted too well. So hence the company executive don't see the need to use portfolio management for their initiative. That could be a legitimate reason. Another legitimate reason is, well, I'm not sure how legitimate, another common reason is that the company is just not that disciplined. So if a chief, let's say chief technology officer, shouting on top of their lung because they want some project and they don't want to go through the process, the people who runs the portfolio management chances are reporting into that role, so they don't want to override their bosses, and hence you have essentially a channel of getting projects approved by shouting them out. For whatever reason, all of these, of course, contribute to, I would say, the sub-optimization of portfolio management. And this graph, to me, clearly shows that. As a matter of fact, a small percentage, thankfully not very large percentage, even have very few projects run through this portfolio management, again, after they build it. The next two chart, we call it 6A, 6B, shows the maturity. So we created based on really the CMI, or Carnegie Mellon's Capability Maturity Index. They have a maturity curve from 1 to 5. We adopted one for portfolio management. So here we adopt 6 levels, actually. 0 is essentially there is no process or consistency. Having said that, the organization does recognize the name project portfolio management. So to answer Lauren's question, the first organization that came up with a very strong, widely adopted maturity index is from Carnegie Mellon, really for measuring, in their case, the maturity of processes around computer science or software development. And it's called CMMI, capital C, capital M, small I. Since that time, a lot of organizations, such as even ours, sort of adopted this mentality of a maturity curve or matrix and make it fit for our situation. So in this case, I made it for portfolio management. So level 0 really shows the organization has no portfolio management, but there may be some notion of it. So it's been conversation, discussion, but there's really no process or consistency. Level 1 is when we targeted that there are some processes and there's consistency to processes. So people may do some of them over time, but they really lack the infrastructure, the governance team, or any type of standing bodies to manage that portfolio management. So in some ways, it's just a set of ad hoc processes. Level 2 is when the organization have started building portfolio management. There are standard processes. There are standards to even change the processes, and chances are there is a supporting structure. Level 3 is when these processes are not only standardized, but they're customized to make it more efficient. Sorry, that's level 4. Level 3 is when they have processes and they start implementing systems to streamline or to make it more consistent. So it becomes a very efficient system. Level 4, which I jumped before, organizations start to some extent to meet the different needs and situation. So for example, if you have a true enterprise portfolio of millions of dollars worth of project, you probably go to a more robust process than say a portfolio of smaller project, 50,000, 20,000, 100,000. You don't want to go to the same level of scrutiny and choke the organization. So all of those are really along the line of effectiveness. Other effectiveness could be applying portfolio management for new development. Is a little bit different than, say, internal improvement projects. All of these are ways to process more effective. And then the level 5 is the highest level, in which it reached a very stable set of adoption, consistency, supported by good tools for efficient operation. And at the same time, it's now starting getting to really of continuous improvement. As you can see from our data, we have organizations responding to all 6 of these categories. Level 0 is essentially no process. Right in the middle, level 2, 30%, which is a pretty nice normal distribution curve, by the way, happen to have some standard, or at least a lot of standard process, but not necessarily always efficient. And then going to the top, I actually know the person who responded to level 5. Without that company away, they work on extraordinarily expensive projects. For them, the point in which the project is approved, there's really no turning back, because even at that point, they already spent millions. And the project itself is easily measured in hundreds of millions, and if not, by the time it goes into sort of the full production mode. So in that organization, they develop extraordinarily robust set of processes. I see a question here. Sir, I'm going to project management in Canada next year. Is it good? And after that, what the future we have, we need to do extra course to get decent jobs. So I will say, Pawan, this is a great question, but topic. So you may want to check out my website, pmoadvisory.com/webinar. And there is another presentation there that's recorded you could find that shows that talks about the career path in project management. So you may be wanted to do that, and that could help figure out a little bit of your answer to your question. So I can't fully address that here because it's a little bit too big, but I'm going to put that in the chat using my second login counts here. So you can see, if you go to that webinar, and for every one of you here, I tend to record these and then make it available there. So you could read those and re-listen to it if you want, okay? So thank you for asking the question. The second part to the is really looking at a very specific instance of how organization manage. As you could imagine, with any portfolio, they should change over time, if nothing else, because things are completed and new ideas come. So at a very practical route, we ask the question, do you have a process to make these changes? And the answer is yes. Are they structured? So meaning that they have written down, people can learn about it, it's highly, highly repeatable? Or is there semi-structure? I mean, there's some parts that may be well documented and trained, but others, we still cope with them as they come up. So if you could think of the structure, process, decision-making as number 2 or higher, my structure as 2 or lower, and then it gets to unstructured, garbage can model, sometimes call it, or random, which even worse, no answer, and some people didn't answer. By the way, a lot of people didn't answer, 26%, which is a little bit interesting that people didn't answer this because I think it may not be clear in their organization. Here you could see that 37% of the processes are structured, and the is another 26%. So that's a good news. About 63% have some kind of structure process, which of course, if you think about it, matches this model particularly well, right? If you essentially add up the 30 and below, you get roughly 60%, actually magically exactly at 60%. So the two data jives. So this is just a drill down in a particular process. It's obvious that what the recommendation is for those of you who are practicing portfolio management. The single most important process you could probably get right is the ability to add and modify and delete components of a portfolio. And by the way, for those of you who's not familiar with portfolio management, we use the word components really means anything within the portfolio. So it could be projects, it could be programs, it could even be smaller portfolio, what we call a sub-portfolio sometimes. On occasion, depending on your organization, we have another chart that shows that. It could even include things like ideas or but for some reason you still want to stay in portfolio management because the performance management aspect. So all of those are just called components, sort of a generic word, means things that's within. Okay, one is interesting one. This one we're still working on, to be honest. We don't have enough data to be conclusive about this. And the question is really, what are in a portfolio, what are the composition of a portfolio? So this is still being studied because we feel like we need to have more data to support this because the data tend to be skewing. But according to the response that we have, only 7 portfolios are composed solely of external facing components, meaning they're for customers. External facing in this case refer to or consulting engagements or construction project you're doing for something else. About 10% are solely internal facing. So, of course, means that of the other 83%, it's a combination, it's a mix. This finding is actually quite important because a lot of the literatures out there assumes a more homogeneous portfolio. This clearly saying, no, it is not homogeneous. If you're looking at drill down a little bit deeper, findings you have is 30% of the components are external facing on average in a portfolio. And external facing again are projects you do for customers, consulting, construction projects, etc. 17% of the components are market facing, so they're doing it for selling a product or service to the customer, market facing, versus sort of the front office is another way to say market facing, versus the middle or the back office, which are really internal. So 50% of the components are internal. Again, the number here we found that it's still a little bit inconclusive, especially number 1 here, that just seems to be too low, but it's what the data hope again to get more data. So in our final report, it's more concrete. The next chart look at the life cycle. Now, I actually have written, I worked on the standard committee with PMI on the standard for portfolio management 4th edition. And afterwards, a part of that team, a slight majority of that team, we went off and wrote on portfolio management. I'll bring that up a little bit later. So we're quite familiar with the life cycle and the stages of portfolio management. But very often in the literature, in the studies out there, it only really shows a very, and that's true even for practitioners. So what I'm saying is the world has viewed portfolio management in far more narrow sense than what the field is capable of. So here, we essentially break it into 7 major stages or phases, right? We treat with 2 stages to idea side. One is a very high-level ideation process, which 84% of organizations seem to utilize. And another is the approval process around it. So the formal proposal, the business case, in 87% of the organization. We also create a stage for holding. So there could be a lot of ideas, business case approved, but not actually implemented. What we found in another study, that seems to be quite a bit of a case because of organizations have limited resources. So one of the organizations we spoke with, they said we every year have 200 people working on projects. That's our capacity. On the other hand, the demand for the project we work on is in the neighborhood of easily triple 600 full-time people to work on. So there's a lot of projects that we have sitting on the shelf, essentially, collecting dust. Even though they're approved for execution, we don't have people to work on it. So one of the questions on the resources is how do we manage that, right? The next phase stage, which is the most common, 95, is patient stage. I'm not sure why it's not 100%. Miss that may not be in portfolio, but I guess I could see in some portfolio discovery R&D portfolio is not about implementation. So maybe that's why it's, but clearly overwhelming. The phase after implementation tend to be some kind of transitioning or pilot. Again, portfolios are fairly big endeavors. So they could go through different stages on their maturity cycle itself before they become fully operational, which is the next to the final stage. Operational components are things that's done from the majority perspective, but there could be sort of a warranty period from project perspective that's still handled by the project team. So that is the phase in the operational. And then finally, we have another, you could call it operation 2 if you want. These are really, everything's completed. But for some reason, the executive decided to keep it instead of taking it out. There could be a number of reasons for that. From a resource perspective, you could have expert resource that just not exist in the general organization, and hence you want to manage that within the portfolio. Or second, it could be more for performance metrics. Some organization may dictate that we want to treat whatever we finish for the first 3 years, put it as a part of the portfolio so we can measure it better. Corollary to this, for example, is 3M. The company, they're very known for their R&D, research development. They have a mandate that X percentage of their revenue must come from new products every single year, right? That's how they drive their innovation engine. So here, rationale for having completed components, completely completed, but still left it in the portfolio management to manage that performance. These 7 stages are particularly interesting for the practitioner and for the researcher out there, because most research tend to focus only on 1, maybe 2 of these stages. And by the way, most practitioner out there probably adopts about 3 to 4 of these on average, not all 7. So this shows the fuller scale of the life cycle as I envision it. Okay. Getting pretty close to, we have about 12 minutes, so we're getting pretty close to the end. 2 more findings. One is funding for portfolio components vary greatly. This is the question that we ask portfolio management, what percentage of projects in your portfolio are funded by portfolio management. And this varies quite greatly. Approximately a quarter are funded exclusively outside of the portfolio, and a little bit about 30% are funded within the portfolio. And then the others are just a mixed bag. This is important to look at the eventual power and the accountability of portfolio. Obviously, if the portfolio manager holds a purse string, he or she will have a lot more authority and power over that. So, question, is the legend cut off? I only could see percentage. I'm sorry, I have to take it offline. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to because I could see both the numbers. So the first set of numbers, let's take the 0 to 10. These are percentage component directly funded by the portfolio. So what this answer is saying is for very little funding to 0 funded by portfolio management, about 24% of the answers fall. The other flip side is for that's almost fully paid by the portfolio, funded by portfolio, 76 to 100%, about 30% of the respondents answer that question. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a better sense. The last major finding asked the question around the governance. Where do governance sit? And you can imagine governance tend to sit slightly half a level or 1 level above the portfolio manager. typically. Sometimes it could be a co-partner, of course. And given that a lot of the portfolios we have here are enterprise, it is no surprise that C-level, executive director, and partners is the highest. What's surprising, by the way, I sometimes don't include blank answer, people who skip the answer, but I include it here because it's a little bit hard to read. Is it because the person's too lazy to answer the question, or is it because they don't know? And given that we do have a high number of people who left it blank and not just only click unsure, we suspect that at least a good portion of them are also unsure, which means that the portfolio process are probably not clear in your respective situation. That, by the way, showed up in the maturity chart to that. So this just gives you another bit of insight. So in summary, we share quite a bit of findings across the studies, and there are actually a couple more that we'll probably talk about in the final study, but as we hopefully get a little more data points. To me, most of these findings are not true surprises. If they are surprised if you wear the practitioner hat, if the academic hat, but if you look across the both, it actually makes quite a bit of sense. The role of project managers are and their accountabilities varies quite greatly. This is leading to the sort of heterogeneity or the complexity of this function. The amount of time and dedicated effort they put in also varies. The adoption, especially even if the company portfolio management may not actually utilize it, is another area. The maturity of portfolio management, you could see, is wide, swings pretty widely, right around 2 as the center point. And the financial control, etc., shows a lot of different practices. So what this study paints is that portfolio management, at the end of the day, is far more complicated and complex than what most academic literature assumes. On the flip, though, is that there are consistencies, repeatabilities, processes that can be leveraged to create that good practice and best practice. So the actual practice of portfolio management can be made more simplified than what a lot of practitioners are arguing as well. So the answer is sort of the middle of the road. If you like the finding here, and I hope people please write this down and join us in this study. If you are a portfolio manager or working portfolio management capability somewhere, please. I'll hope we actually have right now a partner, a software maker that's releasing their study to their customers, and we're going to combine the results eventually. So hopefully we get more data points and we'll be able to share that with everybody. So if you do complete it, you put in your information, we'd be happy to share the final report. You could use it to benchmark your areas, your company, and practices. And of course, if those reasons aren't good enough, hopefully the third reason, help us build portfolio management. Because we really believe that as the world becomes more competitive, any edge that organization can seriously will make them a better practitioner. Okay. Sorry, can we show the PDF code slide? I see that. We haven't got to that slide yet, actually. It's coming up. So a little bit about PMO Advisory, that's what we do. We are a training company, consulting company, but we also conduct a lot of research because we like to close the gap. So we like to be a premier provider of project management, let's say intelligence and training in this area. We have some of our classes coming up for portfolio program management. For those of you who are here, project executives, you know that there aren't many companies, especially PMI registered education providers, that do that. So we have these classes coming up. We have another study, by the way, called Projects During a Pandemic. It's a presentation, a preliminary report that was given actually 2 months ago. That study is still ongoing. So if you want to contribute to that, you can, and you have the link over here. And then these are some of the books I mentioned. I work on the standard committee for PMI, so we developed the 4th edition of the standards that you can see. And about 8 of the team members from the study group actually went off and we led this book creation endeavor, and Pamela and I are the co-lead editor of this book. So this is published by PMI, and I think it's one of the best books. Recently, another university talked to me about a book is their textbook. And most recently, me and Brian Williamson, in this case, published 2 other books that has portfolio management content in there, and fits in the project management. So if you're interested, these are our books. To claim the PDU, one of you are asking about the PDU. The claims code is listed here, 417228WDRU. And we are really on top of the hour soon, so you could claim 1 PDU. And that, of course, will further your career as you earn professional development units. That's what I have prepared for today. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to stay a little bit longer, but feel free to use chat or unmute yourself, and you also have my information. With that said, that's all I have planned for today. So thank you very much. Okay, the journal article link, I think, Lauren, you're asking, was actually was listed earlier. And maybe that's only the abstract. So for some of you who know me, feel free to send me an email. I'll try to get a final version all of you can use as well. It's not copied. 1 second. I have 2 computers. I'm getting computer mixed up. So for those of you who's interested in the article, you can read the abstract here. Okay. Are there any questions before I start recording? Okay. I'm
well,
going to, yes.
One last question. I would assume that doesn't matter if it's an agile portfolio or.
That's a really good question. Agile portfolio, in this book that we have, has a whole chapter on agile portfolio. Mm-hmm. So the short answer is everything that I discussed doesn't really matter because it's really just painting the landscape. But in this chapter, there's actually, there's a chapter on agile portfolio. Okay. And that really talks about and focuses on how organizations are trying to make portfolio management itself introduce it with greater agility to cope with the changes in the organization.
Yeah, I see that especially with digital transformation.
Absolutely. So the short answer is yes, I think it is real. I think there is a lot of application for it. But this study is a lot more fundamental. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really touch the methodology aspect. But that actually area of future study, most definitely.
Well, that's kind of what concerns me, though, with the future as it is, given the current situation. I'm just sensing more of a digital, more of a shift, and it'd be more of agility. And I think
yes.
that is going to change the way we are managing our portfolios.
And that's true. But one thing I will say about portfolio management is, at least my personal preference, so this is now me, not the field. I think people should think slower, not make decisions more thoroughly, look at the parameters and do their analysis and homework, but execute faster. What I found a lot of is they think slowly and they execute slowly because paralysis, right? Analysis paralysis is a common problem. Mm-hmm. So when you start thinking, but when you want to think about things, and especially before you commit a lot of resources, the decision have resource and budget implications. Do your homework. So on the agility side of the portfolio management, my personal preference has always advocating companies is, yes, we could be faster, but faster is in the process, the frequency of meeting, how you evaluate project, but not faster because you started doing things shortcuts. Because the last thing you want is spend millions of dollars and found that you did one project. Okay. Let me answer Jace question, and then I will stop the recording, but we could still stay on and address more questions. Can you please advise how a portfolio direction strategy is choosing an organization? You know, that is a broader question around strategy making, especially how strategies are chosen. And organizations have various different. There sometimes do give on strategy and strategy formulation that gets to that question. So it's a little bit outside of the scope of today's presentation. The portfolio management itself usually highly leverage the organization's strategy formulation, strategy planning, strategic planning processes. Because the goal is to make things more real, more executable. So it does depend a little bit on organization. Organization would definitely have a very different set of processes than, let's say, a Fortune 500 company. So I'll leave it at that. Are there any other good questions that want to be recorded before I end the recording? And then again, I'll stay longer for those of you who have questions. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now. Oh, can you see the PDU slides again? Absolutely.